January 17, 1945. Fort McClellan, Alabama. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside the barbed wire gates, its engine ticking in the cold morning air. Inside, 23 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated cargo bay. Among them were 3 women captured Luftwaffe auxiliary siege in various stages of pregnancy. The youngest, 22-year-old Helga Schneider, pressed her hand against the canvas siding, feeling the vibration of American soil beneath the wheels. She had been told many things about this country, none of them good. For 6 weeks, she had carried her child across the Atlantic, through processing camps in England, and finally onto a Liberty ship bound for Norfolk. The other prisoners had whispered stories during the crossing tales of American brutality, of forced labor camps where German captives were worked to death in coal mines, of prison yards where guards amused themselves by withholding food and medical care. These were not random rumors. They were carefully constructed narratives, planted by Reich propaganda and nurtured by desperation. Helga had served in a radar installation outside Hamburg. She had seen the bombers come, wave after wave, turning her city into an inferno. She had been captured during the final chaotic retreat, trying to reach her parents' farmhouse in the countryside. Now, pregnant and defeated, she expected punishment. The truck doors opened. Winter sunlight streamed in. What Helga Schneider, and thousands like her, could not have anticipated was this: that captivity in America would unravel everything they believed about power, about ideology, about the nature of the enemy they had been taught to hate. The experience would not break them through cruelty. It would shatter them through abundance, through kindness, through the simple, undeniable revelation that the stories they had been fed were lies. This is the story of pregnant prisoners of war who crossed an ocean expecting hell and found something far more dangerous to fascist ideology. They found America as it actually was. The women who arrived at American POW camps in the winter of 1945 represented a small but significant fraction of the nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners held on American soil during World War II. Most were men, captured in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and finally Germany itself as the Wehrmacht collapsed. But among them were several hundred women Luftwaffe communications specialists, Wehrmacht administrative staff, nurses attached to military units who had been deemed combatants under international law and processed as prisoners of war rather than civilian internees. The pregnant women among them occupied a peculiar legal and moral space. Under the Geneva Convention, pregnant prisoners were entitled to special care, but the convention had been written in an era when female combatants were virtually unknown. American military planners, confronted with this unprecedented situation, improvised. They established special medical facilities at several camps, primarily in the South where the climate was milder and existing military bases could be repurposed. Fort McClellan in Alabama, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and Camp Forrest in Tennessee all received pregnant POWs beginning in late 1944. The women arrived expecting the worst. Helga Schneider, before her capture, had attended weekly propaganda lectures in her radar unit. She had seen the films. One, titled The American Colossus, portrayed the United States as a nation of gangsters and plutocrats where working people starved while industrialists grew fat on war profits. Another film showed alleged footage of German prisoners in American camps, beaten and forced to march through snow without adequate clothing. Her commanding officer, a stern woman named Hauptmann Vogel, had been explicit: if you are captured, expect no mercy. The Americans hate us. They will use you, abuse you, and discard you. This is what democracy means: the strong devour the weak. These were not isolated warnings. The Reich's propaganda machine had spent years constructing an image of America, designed to prevent German soldiers from surrendering. The message was consistent: captivity meant torture, starvation, and death. Better to fight to the last bullet. Better to die for the Führer than to fall into enemy hands. Helga had believed it. Most did. The gates of Fort McClellan opened, and the truck rolled through. The camp stretched across former National Guard training grounds, row upon row of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at intervals, but they were fewer and less imposing than Helga had imagined. American soldiers in olive uniforms directed the prisoners toward a processing building, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. No one shouted. No one struck anyone. An officer with captain's bars approached the group, accompanied by a medical officer wearing a Red Cross armband. "Anyone here speak English?" the captain asked. Helga raised her hand slowly. She had learned English in gymnasium before the war, studied it from books that would later be banned as promoting foreign corruption. The captain nodded to her. "Tell your group they'll be processed for medical screening. The pregnant women will be taken to the camp hospital for examination. Everyone will receive clean clothing, bedding, and a meal. No one will be harmed," she translated, her voice uncertain. The other prisoners watched the Americans carefully, waiting for the trap to spring. It did not spring. The camp hospital was a converted barracks building with white-painted walls and actual glass windows. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint. 3 army nurses, all women in their 20s, greeted the pregnant prisoners with calm professionalism. They were directed to examination rooms, where a Dr. Captain Robert Morrison, a civilian physician from Michigan, before the war conducted thorough medical assessments. Helga's examination took 40 minutes. Captain Morrison spoke to her through an interpreter, a German-American private who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1938. The doctor measured her blood pressure, listened to the fetal heartbeat, estimated her due date at early April. He noted her malnutrition, the signs of anemia, the vitamin deficiencies common among civilians in Germany's collapsing economy during the final year of the war. "You're about 6 months along," Morrison said, making notes on a clipboard. "The baby seems healthy despite the circumstances. We'll put you on a high-protein diet, supplements, and bed rest for a week to get your strengths back up. After that, light work only, nothing that risks the pregnancy." Helga waited for the other shoe to drop, for the demand for labor, for the reduced rations, for the punishment. "You'll be housed in a separate barracks with the other expectant mothers," Morrison continued. "We've set up a prenatal care program. You'll see me or one of the other doctors twice a week. When you go into labor, you'll deliver here in the hospital with full medical support." The interpreter translated. Helga stared at him. "This is standard for all prisoners?" she asked in German. "This is standard for pregnant women," the private replied. "POW or not, Army regulations require proper medical care, Geneva Convention and all that." She did not understand. The Reich had signed the Geneva Convention, but it had been understood as propaganda, as a Western weakness to be exploited. She had seen wounded Soviet prisoners left to die in railroad sidings. She had heard stories of the camps in the East, though such talk was dangerous and quickly silenced. The idea that America would actually follow these rules, would actually treat enemy combatants with medical care and dignity, did not fit into any framework she possessed. That night, in a barracks heated by coal stoves and lit by electric bulbs, Helga received her first American meal as a prisoner of war. It arrived on a metal tray carried by a prisoner trustee, a captured Afrika Korps sergeant who had been in American custody since 1943. He set it down on the wooden table without ceremony. The tray contained a portion of pot roast with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, 2 slices of white bread with butter, a small salad, and a cup of coffee. For dessert, there was a square of yellow cake. Helga stared at it. The other 2 pregnant women in the barracks stared at it. "Is this real?" one of them whispered. Greta Hoffman, a nurse captured in France, 7 months pregnant. The trustee shrugged. "This is what they feed us every day. Sometimes better. They gave us turkey at Christmas. Real turkey." It was incomprehensible. Helga had not seen meat in regular meals since 1943, in Germany. Even before her capture, rations had been reduced to bread, potatoes, and occasional turnips. The meat on this tray, the butter on real white bread, the fresh vegetables represented more food value than she had typically consumed in 3 days. "This is ... normal?" she asked the trustee in German. "Welcome to America," he said, and walked away. They ate slowly, almost fearfully, expecting each bite to be their last before the tray was snatched away. But no one came. When they finished, another trustee collected the trays and brought hot water for washing. Later, an American nurse stopped by to check on them, asked if they needed anything, and provided clean nightgowns for sleeping. Helga lay awake that night in a real bed with clean sheets, her hand on her swelling belly, trying to reconcile what she had experienced with what she had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was profound. She had expected deprivation and found abundance. She had expected cruelty and found professional medical care. She had expected hell and found something strange and basic human decency. It was, in its own way, more devastating than torture would have been. The phenomenon that Helga experienced was not unique. Throughout the American POW camp system, Axis prisoners confronted a reality that contradicted everything their governments had told them. The disconnect was particularly acute for German prisoners who had been subjected to years of Nazi propaganda about American weakness, American degeneracy, American barbarism. The reality they encountered was different. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, German POWs worked in agricultural labor programs alongside American farmers. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, money they could spend at camp canteens stocked with American goods. They attended movies, formed orchestras, published camp newspapers. They ate meals that exceeded in quality and quantity what many American civilians consumed under wartime rationing. One prisoner, a former Panzer crewman named Hans Lammersdorf, later wrote, "We had been told America was on the verge of starvation, that the war effort had stripped the country bare. Instead, I gained weight. We all did. The abundance was impossible to explain within the framework we had been given." At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, Italian POWs cultivated vegetable gardens and were allowed to cook their own food using camp supplies. They organized soccer leagues and theatrical productions. Security was relaxed to the point where escape, while theoretically possible, seemed pointless. Where would they go, and why? Many prisoners described their captivity as the best fed, safest period of their lives. At Fort McClellan, Helga Schneider and the other pregnant women entered a routine that seemed surreal in its ordinary kindness. Twice a week, They reported to the camp hospital for prenatal checkups. Captain Morrison tracked their weight gain, monitored fetal development, and adjusted their diets accordingly. The women received vitamin supplements, iron tablets, and calcium pills, medications that had been scarce in Germany even before the war intensified. They were excused from work details, allowed to rest during the day, and given extra blankets for comfort. In February, Helga attended her first group prenatal class, conducted by an army nurse named Lieutenant Patricia Callahan. 8 pregnant POWs sat in a semicircle while Callahan explained the stages of labor, breathing techniques, and what to expect during delivery. She used charts, drawings, and a medical dummy to illustrate key points. The session lasted 2 hours. Afterward, Helga approached Lieutenant Callahan. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in halting English. Callahan looked at her, puzzled. "Doing what?" This Helga gestured at the charts, at the hospital, at everything. "Why treat us this way? We are the enemy." The nurse considered the question seriously. "You're pregnant women under our care," she said finally. "That's all that matters right now, war or no war. You deserve proper medical attention. Your babies deserve a chance at a healthy start. That's not about politics. That's about being human." It was a very American answer, pragmatic, individualistic, focused on immediate humanity rather than abstract ideology. Helga did not entirely understand it, but she recognized its sincerity. As winter turned to spring, the routines of camp life continued. The pregnant women rose at 7, ate breakfast in the mess hall, eggs, bacon, toast, juice, coffee, then spent their mornings in light activities. Some attended English classes run by a prisoner who had studied languages at Heidelberg. Others worked in the camp library, cataloging books donated by the Red Cross. The afternoons were reserved for rest, reading, or walking around the exercise yard. The food continued to astonish. Every meal was abundant, varied, and nutritionally dense. The prisoners received meat 6 days a week. Fresh fruit appeared regularly, orange juice from Florida, apples from Washington State. The bread was soft and white, made from refined flour that had become a distant memory in Germany. Even the coffee was real coffee, not the ersatz grain-based substitute that had replaced it in the Reich. One evening in March, Helga sat with Greta Hoffmann in the barracks, sharing an orange. The fruit had arrived that afternoon as part of the regular supply delivery. Greta peeled it slowly, savoring the smell. "I cannot reconcile this," Greta said quietly. "Everything we were told was a lie." "Not everything," Helga replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Everything that matters." Greta separated a segment, ate it, closed her eyes. "They told us America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. But look at this fresh fruit in March, in a prison camp, for enemy soldiers. They have so much they can afford to waste it on us. What does that say about who was really strong?" It was a dangerous line of thought, one that led to darker questions. If America was not weak, then what else had been lies? If American captivity was not brutal, then what did that say about German conduct in other theaters? If this democracy they had been taught to despise could produce such overwhelming material abundance, what did that mean about the superiority of the Reich system? The prisoners did not discuss such things openly, but the thoughts were there, growing like the children in their bellies, impossible to ignore. On March 28, 1945, Greta Hoffmann went into labor. She was transported to the camp hospital at 4 in the morning, accompanied by Lieutenant Callahan and another nurse. Helga, awake and unable to sleep as her own due date approached, watched through the barracks window as the ambulance drove away, its red cross marking bright even in the darkness. She did not see Greta again until the following afternoon when Helga visited the hospital. She found Greta in a clean bed, propped up with pillows, holding a swaddled infant boy. The baby was healthy, 7 pounds, 9 ounces, all fingers and toes accounted for. Captain Morrison had overseen the delivery personally. There had been no complications. Mother and child were doing well. "They gave me ether for the pain," Greta said, wonder in her voice. "Real anesthetic. The doctor said I was a patient, that no woman should have to suffer unnecessarily during childbirth. He treated me like I was his own sister." The baby stirred, made a small sound. Greta adjusted her grip, looked down at her son's face. "What will you name him?" Helga asked. "Robert," Greta said after the doctor. "He saved us both." By April, 3 more babies had been born in the Fort McClellan camp hospital, all healthy, all delivered with full medical support. The maternity ward became a strange pocket of normalcy within the surreal context of captivity. American nurses cooed over the infants, brought small gifts donated by local churches, taught the German mothers American lullabies. The camp commander authorized additional rations for nursing mothers, extra milk, eggs, cheese, and meat to support lactation. Helga's son was born on April 9th, 3 days after the American Army liberated Buchenwald concentration camp, though she would not learn that detail until much later. The delivery took 6 hours. Captain Morrison administered ether when the pain became too intense. Nurses monitored her vital signs, adjusted her position, provided ice chips and encouragement. When her son finally emerged, crying and red and alive, they cleaned him, weighed him, placed him on her chest while they delivered the placenta and stitched her "He's beautiful," Lieutenant Callahan said, and meant it. Helga held her son, felt his warmth, his weight, his impossible fragility. In that moment, the war seemed very far away and very close at the same time. She had brought a child into a world at war, but he had been born in safety, delivered by enemy hands that had treated her with more care than her own government had ever provided. She named him Thomas, after her father. The symbolic weight of food continued to permeate every aspect of camp life. It became the most visible, tangible evidence of the vast gulf between Nazi propaganda and American reality. The prisoners could debate ideology, could argue about political systems and national character, but they could not argue with the meals that arrived 3 times a day, every day, without fail. The food represented something more than sustenance. It was proof of American industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and logistical mastery. It was evidence of a system that could afford to feed its enemies well while simultaneously supplying vast armies across 2 oceans. It was a daily, undeniable demonstration of the material superiority of democratic capitalism over fascist autarky. One prisoner, an economics professor from Munich captured in the final weeks of the war, later wrote about this realization: "We had been taught that our system was efficient, scientific, superior. But efficiency is measured in results. America could fight a global war, supply its allies, and still feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own citizens in peacetime. This was not a small gap. It was a chasm that revealed the fundamental lie at the heart of our ideology. For the pregnant women, the food took on additional significance. They were eating not just for themselves but for their children. An American abundance was literally building the bodies of the next generation. Every glass of milk, every portion of meat, every vitamin tablet represented an investment in infants who carried German blood but would be formed from American resources. By May 1945, the war in Europe had ended. News filtered into the camps through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official announcements. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after 12. The prisoners at Fort McClellan gathered in the recreation hall to hear the announcement. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence. A few cheered quietly, relief that the dying was over outweighing any residual loyalty to a regime that had led them to disaster. Helga, holding Thomas, felt a strange mixture of emotions: grief for the Germany that had been, relief that the killing had stopped, and a creeping, an uncomfortable awareness that everything she had fought for had been built on lies. The America she had been taught to hate had treated her with more humanity than her own government had ever shown to its designated enemies. In the following weeks, as the full horror of the concentration camps was revealed through newsreels and documentation, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable for many prisoners. The images from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Auschwitz could not be dismissed as Allied propaganda. They were too well documented, too consistent, too overwhelming. The contrast between American treatment of POWs and German treatment of concentration camp inmates was stark and damning. Some prisoners refused to believe. They called it lies, exaggeration, fabrication. But others, confronted with evidence and having experienced American conduct firsthand, began to question everything they had been taught. If their government had lied about the camps, and lied about America, what else had been lies? The pregnant POWs occupied a unique position in this psychological transformation. They had experienced American captivity not just as soldiers but as mothers. They had been vulnerable, dependent, and received care that exceeded anything promised by their own system. Their babies had been delivered by enemy doctors, fed with enemy milk, protected by enemy guards. Lieutenant Callahan, making her rounds in the maternity ward, once found Helga crying quietly while nursing Thomas. "Are you in pain?" the nurse asked, concerned. "No," Helga said. "I am just understanding things I did not want to understand." "What things?" "That you are not monsters, that we were wrong, that everything was wrong." Callahan sat on the edge of the bed, considering her response. "I can't speak to your politics or your war," she said finally, "but I can tell you this: what you're experiencing here, this is what we believe in, that every person has worth, that even enemies deserve basic humanity, that there's enough for everyone if we're willing to share. Maybe that's naive, maybe that's weakness, but it's what America is supposed to be about." As spring turned to summer, the camp began to prepare for repatriation. The war was over. Germany was occupied. The prisoners would eventually be sent home, though when and how remained unclear. For the mothers with infants, the prospect was complicated. What would they return to? Their cities were rubbled. Their economy was destroyed. Food was scarce. Medical care was nearly non-existent in many areas. Some of the women expressed fear about leaving, not because they had grown to love captivity, but because they recognized that their children had a better chance of survival in American custody than in defeated Germany. It was a bitter irony that enemy imprisonment provided more security than freedom in their homeland. The camp administration, recognizing this, worked with the Red Cross to ensure that returning mothers received extra supplies. Each woman was given a care package containing powdered milk, canned food, infant clothing, blankets, basic medicines, and vitamins. These packages, assembled by American military personnel, represented more material support than many German mothers could expect from their own shattered government. Helga received her package in August. She held the cans of condensed milk, the tiny sweaters donated by church groups in Alabama, the vitamins in labeled bottles, and felt the weight of unintended symbolism. Even in defeat, even as prisoners being repatriated, they were leaving with gifts from the nation they had fought against. The repatriation ships departed from New York Harbor in September 1945. Helga stood on deck with Thomas in her arms, watching the Statue of Liberty recede into the distance. The great copper woman held her torch aloft, a symbol she had been taught to scorn as bourgeois sentimentality. Now, having lived 6 months under the protection of the ideals that statue represented, the symbolism struck her differently. Around her on the deck, other former prisoners watched in silence. They were going home to a Germany that no longer existed, carrying children who had been born in captivity, fed by enemy resources, delivered by enemy doctors who had treated them with more care than they had any reason to expect. One woman, a former radio operator named Marguerite, spoke quietly. "What will we tell them?" "Who?" Helga asked. "Our children, when they are old enough to ask. What will we tell them about the people who cared for us when we were supposed to be enemies?" It was a question without a simple answer. How do you explain to a child that he was born in a prison camp but delivered in safety, that he was fed with enemy milk but thrived, that the nation his mother had fought against had treated her with more humanity than his mother's own nation had shown to millions? "We will tell them the truth," Helga said finally, "that war is complicated, that good people can be found on all sides, that America was not what we were told it would be." "And what was it?" Helga looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully against her chest, his small body built from American food, protected by American medicine, delivered into a world by American hands. "It was everything we were afraid it would be," she said. "It was proof that we were wrong. The historical record is clear on this point. American treatment of Axis posts during World War II was, with few exceptions, exemplary by the standards of international law. Prisoners were housed, fed, and provided medical care that met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Pregnant women received specialized prenatal and postnatal care. Infants born in captivity were provided with nutrition and medical attention. The death rate among POAs in American custody was less than 1% lower than the mortality rate among American soldiers in combat. This was not accidental. It was deliberate policy, rooted in American adherence to international law, humanitarian principles, and pragmatic recognition that proper treatment of POTs served strategic purposes. Well-treated prisoners provided valuable intelligence, had no incentive to escape, and represented potential goodwill ambassadors when they returned home. But beyond policy and strategy, there was something else at work: a fundamental belief, however imperfectly realized in other contexts, that even enemies possessed inherent human dignity, that pregnant women deserved medical care regardless of their nationality, that infants deserved nutrition regardless of the sins of their parents' governments, that abundance should be shared, not hoarded. This was the America that Helga Schneider and thousands of other prisoners encountered, not the propaganda caricature, but the lived reality of democratic values expressed through material plenty and institutional humanity. In the decades after the war, many former POWs who had been held in America maintained that their captivity had been a transformative experience. They had expected hell and found something far more dangerous to fascist ideologies. They found an alternative vision of how society could be organized, one based on individual dignity, material abundance, and institutional compassion. Some returned to Germany and became advocates for democracy, carrying with them the lived experience of American values. Others remained silent, uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they had experienced. But almost all, when asked, acknowledged that American captivity had changed them. The children born in those camps grew up as citizens of a new Germany, one rebuilt under democratic principles with American assistance. Some learned later about the circumstances of their birth, that they had entered the world in enemy hands, that their first breaths had been drawn in an Alabama prison camp, that they had been delivered by doctors who had no obligation to care for them, beyond basic legal requirements, but who had treated their mothers with professional compassion. Thomas Schneider, who never met Captain Morrison but bore a name chosen in honor of the doctor's kindness, grew up to become a physician himself. In a letter written late in his life, he reflected on his mother's stories about his birth. "She told me that she had expected to die in captivity, or at best to be neglected. Instead, she received better medical care than most German women got in their own hospitals." This paradox haunted her. It forced her to confront the reality that the enemy she had been taught to hate was more humane than the regime she had served. "I think this is why she insisted I become a doctor, to repay a debt she felt she could never fully discharge." The story of pregnant posts in American camps is not a story of suffering overcome through courage. It is a story of expectations shattered through abundance, of ideology undermined through kindness, of propaganda dismantled through material reality. It is a story about the power of democratic values, not as abstract principles but as lived experience. The women who arrived at places like Fort McClellan expected hell because they had been taught that America represented the worst aspects of human nature: greed, cruelty, degeneracy. They expected to be punished, starved, abused. They expected their vulnerability to be exploited. What they found instead was a system that, despite its many flaws and contradictions, could extend basic humanity even to enemies, that could provide medical care to pregnant combatants, that could deliver their children safely and feed them adequately, that could treat them not as monsters to be destroyed but as human beings to be housed, fed, and repatriated when the fighting stopped. This was more devastating to fascist ideology than any battlefield defeat. Military loss could be explained away through betrayal, bad luck, superior numbers, but the daily experience of American abundance and institutional compassion could not be rationalized. It was too immediate, too personal, too undeniable. The metal food trays that arrived 3 times a day became, in retrospect, the most powerful weapons in the ideological war, not because they were withheld but because they were provided, because they proved that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that free societies generated more wealth than authoritarian ones, that the American system, chaotic, individualistic, commercial, and deeply imperfect, could create abundance sufficient to feed even its enemies generously. This was the truth that pregnant POWs carried home with them, that America was not weak, not decadent, not on the verge of collapse. It was overwhelmingly strong, not despite its democratic values but because of them. The same system that protected individual liberty also generated staggering material wealth. The same principles that guaranteed free speech also fostered innovation. The same institutions that enabled dissent also produced surpluses. And perhaps most importantly, America could afford to be kind, not because kindness cost nothing: medical care, food, housing, all required resources, but because the system generated enough surplus that kindness became possible even toward enemies. There is a photograph taken at Fort McClellan in June 1945. It shows a group of German mothers sitting in the camp hospital nursery, holding their infants. An American nurse stands among them, smiling. The women look tired but healthy. The babies are well fed, clean, wrapped in blankets donated by church groups. On a nearby table, bottles of formula wait to be warmed. The photograph was not staged for propaganda purposes. It was simply a documentary record, one of thousands taken at POW camps across America. But it captures something essential about the experience these women had. They are enemy combatants, holding children delivered by enemy doctors, fed with enemy resources, protected by enemy guards. They are prisoners who received better prenatal care than many American civilians. They are mothers whose babies thrived in captivity while children in their homeland starved amid the ruins. The photo does not resolve the moral complexities of war. It does not erase the crimes committed by the regime these women served. It does not excuse the ideology they had embraced or the suffering caused by German aggression. But it does testify to a simple truth, that even in war, even between bitter enemies, humanity can persist. That abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity hoarded. That the values democracy claims to uphold: individual dignity, institutional compassion, material prosperity broadly distributed, can be more than empty propaganda. When the last ships carrying repatriated prisoners departed American shores in late 1945, they carried with them thousands of former enemies who had experienced something unexpected. They had learned that the nation they had been taught to hate was not what they had imagined. They had seen democracy not as abstraction but as lived reality, messy, imperfect, but capable of extending humanity, even to those who had raised arms against it. The pregnant women among them carried additional knowledge. They knew what it meant to be vulnerable in enemy hands and to be protected nonetheless. They knew what it meant to give birth in a prison camp and receive better medical care than they could have expected at home. They knew what it meant to nurse their children on milk provided by the nation they had fought against. This knowledge could not be unlearned. It would shape their understanding of the world, influence how they raised their children, color their perception of politics and ideology for the rest of their lives. Some would try to forget, to push the experience away as an anomaly or a trick, but others would carry it forward, a small seed of truth planted in hostile soil, waiting to grow. Helga Schneider returned to Hamburg in October 1945. The city she had known was gone, replaced by rubble and ruin. Her parents had survived, barely, living in a cellar beneath their destroyed farmhouse. She gave them the care package from the Americans: the powdered milk, the canned food, the vitamins. It sustained the family through that first terrible winter. She never spoke much about her time in captivity, but her son noticed things. She never complained about shortages. She never blamed the Allies for Germany's suffering. She taught Thomas to judge people by their actions, not their nationality. And when he asked, late in her life, what the war had taught her, she gave him a simple answer: I learned that the people I was told to hate treated me better than the people I was told to serve. I learned that abundance is real, not propaganda. I learned that democracy is not weakness, it is strength enough to be kind to enemies. And I learned that everything I believed was a lie. The American camp where she had been held, where her son had been born, no longer exists. Fort McClellan was decommissioned decades ago, its barracks torn down, its hospital converted and eventually abandoned. The site is now contaminated with industrial waste, a Superfund cleanup project. There is no marker commemorating the prisoners who lived there, the mothers who gave birth there, the small acts of humanity that took place within its wire boundaries. But the truth remains. Pregnant prisoners of war came to America expecting hell. What they found instead was more dangerous to fascism than any battlefield defeat. They found proof that the democratic ideal, however imperfectly realized, could produce both abundance and compassion. They found that the enemy they had been taught to destroy was capable of treating them with more humanity than their own system had ever promised. And in that discovery, in that small revelation repeated thousands of times across hundreds of camps, a certain kind of war was won not through violence but through the undeniable evidence of shared meals, clean hospital beds, and babies delivered safely by hands that had every reason to refuse care but provided it anyway. This is what remains when the guns fall silent. The memory of unexpected kindness, the stubborn persistence of human decency even in circumstances designed to destroy it, and the simple revolutionary truths that abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity hoarded, that democracy expressed through action is stronger than dictatorship preached through propaganda, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields but in hospital wards, one mother, one child, one metal food tray at a time.